Hello! In this video I'm going to show you how I painted an illustration for Caleb and the All-Seeing Glasses. You can see here the completed illustration, which I've inked in with a permanent pen, and now I need to colour it in using my watercolour paints. So I started by thinking about the room. It's actually quite hard to come up with a complete interior colour scheme, so I was looking to do a kind of country cottage look. Remember, the Germans have taken over someone's house. So I began with some pink curtains, thinking those would go quite well with greens and blues. And then I wanted to go for a greeny beige carpet, but quite soft, so I was careful to try some different options and then make sure it was really dilute before I painted that in. If I'd gone for a dark wash, I could have made a big mistake and spoiled the whole picture. So I was quite pleased with what I put down there and moved on to the chairs in the centre. I thought a strong dark blue, ultramarine blue with a little bit of Payne's grey would make a nice strong focal point. You can see that I keep the brush moving fast. I don't try and colour it in carefully to the edges, because when you get those little breaks of white it makes it look more realistic. For the rug underneath, I wanted to do something more interesting than just a single colour, so I wet the whole area and then I dropped in some colour onto that wet paper which makes it bleed. And I did some swirls of pinks and some swirls of greens just to suggest a posher rug that's got lots going on, and that worked quite well. After I'd done that, I then started to work on the uniforms, so I mixed the sort of military green using some bright sap green, some yellow ochre and some raw umber, and did an initial wash with that. Then I remembered I needed the red on the general's uniforms, so I added that in. And while I was letting that dry, I continued on other parts of the room. So I've added some pink on the sashes for the curtains, Isabella's dress, checking it was the same as the one in the previous picture. The presentation cushion and another dark crimson. And then I started working on the furniture. So generally I was going for dark browns, antique looking. For the shelf, for the drawer unit on the left, I again used wet on wet. So I wet the paper, put some wet browns in there, so it ended up looking quite reflective and shiny as though it had been highly varnished. So the frame, the units at the back, I did vary the browns that I was using. I have 3 or 4 different browns on my palette. With the coffee table, you see I used the wet and wet again so that it would look nice and shiny and reflective. Often you want to add a second wash of colour because the first one will dry quite pale and doesn't have much impact. Chandelier with some coppery yellow ochre and some yellow. Then continuing with the general's uniforms, now the red has dried. Again, knowing I'd come back with a second coat to make the shadows a bit stronger. Some final details with the browns and the coppers. Now you can see I've done the boots here using a strong black, leaving some pretty severe highlights, because that's what you get with shiny leather boots. I'm using some pale grey here just to add some reflections in the glass. The newsprint, initially I think I did it too dark, so I lifted some paint out. For the picture in the background, did a little sketch of a headland, used my cerulean blue, which is good for skies, and then ultramarine blue for the sea. Doing the flower pot, using a couple of different greens, straight from the palette. I added some leaves that didn't have the ink outline, but that's quite nice for just suggesting more. I didn't go overboard with colours. I didn't want the flower pot to detract too much attention from the centre of the picture. Isabella's hair, and now I'm adding in the darker mix of the uniform green just to suggest the shadows and make it look more three-dimensional, which works really well. For the display cabinet, just added a few suggested objects using colours I already had on my palette. Worked in the sand and a bit more colour in the headland in the painting. The all-seeing glasses, a few touches of colour. Handles on the unit. And just looking for the little things that need a bit of strengthening or things you've missed. More greys around the walls and ceiling. The skin uses bright red and bright yellow, but really massively diluted, and you're just touching that in, keeping some highlights on the cheeks and noses, and then you add a second pass of that where it needs to be even darker. So now I've got my washable pen just to add a few areas with that bleeding effect, which is part of the style that the book's using. I didn't do too much of that because with all the people and the intricate details it could have gone badly wrong. Adding a little bit more colour in the faces. Remember, General Ivan Datta's got a red face, so I needed to add a bit more of my skin colour with some red. Just checking for things I'd missed, like Isabella's shoes, a stripe of orange on the cigarette case. Keep standing back, seeing what's missing, make the eyes a bit darker. And voila, it's finished.